and we're really humbled to say that we have an incredible guest, and that's Rabbi Doron Perez. Rabbi Doron Perez, those who watch the briefings, you've had a chance to learn from him, to hear from him in the past. His son, Yonatan, who is a commander in the paratroopers, in the elite infantry, and he has a son, Daniel, whose body is being held by Hamas as we speak, who is a commander in the tank corps, one of these incredibly brave young men who fought way overwhelmed in terms of numbers by the Hamas as they entered on October 7th, the Black Simchas Torah. He led a tank group that saved multiple lives, in the meantime sacrificing his own life. And tragically, it was a situation where the family did not know if he was alive or dead. It was determined that he had lost his life, but his body is being held by Hamas. Rabbi Perez is a fascinating man on a number of levels. He was a rabbinical and educational leader, a real leader of the spirit of the South African Jewish community for many, many years. And he was recruited to become the world leader of the Mizrachi movement. Mizrachi is the religious Zionist movement. And in that position, he's expanded Mizrachi on the European continent, here in North America, in South America, South Africa, Australia, and parts across the globe. He's an incredibly tender soul. He's a mensch. He's kind. He's thoughtful. He's introspective. And what he's going through right now, to a certain degree, we've always turned to him because he can articulate what many of the families are going through. Articulate it in English, which is his first language, and in a way that hopefully will sensitize us to what these families tragically have been going through for the course of the last year. Rabbi Perez, we'd like to hand it over to you. It's just an honor, it's a humbling honor for us to be having you as our guest this week and to be able to ask you questions, to learn from you. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Rabbi Wal, for your very generous and kind words of introduction. It's an honor and privilege to be with you in whatever forum you find yourself, and having got to know you over the years in your significant leadership position in the Orthodox Union. And now, of course, for many years now, making such a difference to perhaps one of the most important organizations in the Jewish world today, the Friends of the IDF. Boy, do we need friends, and boy, does the IDF need friends. Because to befriend the IDF is to befriend the emissaries of morality, of a level of sensitivity in warfare that many have said is unparalleled in the history of urban warfare, despite the noise and the condemnations of the haters and the ignorant. And therefore, I just want to bless you and all your donor community and all the listeners, whether it's evening, afternoon, or morning, wherever you are, to continue to support this wonderful organization, to be a friend of the IDF, and to support the IDF in every possible way. Many of you from around the world have children who are lone soldiers. Many of us in Israel are people who've made Aliyah, like our family and our sons made Aliyah and served in the IDF. And today, the blood libel of our generation, in my opinion, the soldiers of Israel, to condemn our holy, sensitive, sensible, kind, yet resolute soldiers who, God forbid, are the shlichim of a murderous, genocidal people, who, God forbid, are murdering innocent civilians, killing babies on the other side, even to utter the horrific words in the same line of the state of Israel and genocide, is undoubtedly, in my opinion, the blood libel of our generation. Previous blood libels, when Judaism was under attack, so as we all know, it was baking matzah. I mean, who in their right mind can imagine the Jewish people, where the Torah on multiple occasions says that we're not allowed to eat the blood, ki hadam ha'nefesh, we may never consume blood. Blood is an absolute prohibition in the Torah. We may not consume blood. Yet which warped mind can come up of all things, this conspiracy theory that Jews will use non-Jewish blood in the baking of matzah? There could be nothing more ridiculous than the Jewish people using blood in any ritual and eating it in any way because it's antithetical to everything we stand for millennia. Yet that has not stopped the haters and the ignorant to conjure up these fanciful views, perverse views of the Jewish people, to be a blood libel, that the Jewish people spill blood of innocent Christian children to bake their matzah. And today, the bloodletting is the bloodletting of our soldiers, of the Jewish people, who the soldiers of the IDF are the emissaries of all of the Jewish people, the Jewish state, not only all the citizens and civilians, Jews and non-Jews alike, of the state of Israel, but also Jews all over the world and Zionists all over the world who love and support Jewish destiny and who stand on the side of light, life, and morality against those who choose darkness, death, and perverseness. And therefore today, supporting the state of Israel and specifically standing beside its emissaries, the IDF, is arguably the greatest moral conviction and commitment that a person can have today. It is standing up for the blood libel of our generation, and we need to protest it in every possible way. All of us here know that indeed it is the other side which does unimaginable things. Which Jew can possibly imagine putting their children in front of them? Which fair human being in the Western world can possibly imagine that in order to protect the life of a parent, we would put our child in front of us? We would all take a bullet for our child. Which normative Western human being, and certainly the Jewish people who have taught the world about the concept of being created in the image of God, we would die, all of us, before we would endanger our children and our parents in any way. Yet we are fighting a most cynical enemy, which not only has total disregard for civilians on the other side, in contravention of every Geneva Convention, of every consensus of normative human behavior and warfare, which says combatants strike at combatants, civilians are non-combatants. Yet we all know that the non-combatants on the Israeli side, Jews or non-Jews, young and old, have always been targeted, and we all know how they're butchered in the most barbaric way on October 7th. Still, as we speak, as we all know, there's still 101 hostages. Who would have believed almost 1 year later? Who could have believed that we would still have 101 hostages? One of them, unfortunately, is our son, Daniel, Hashem Yikom Damo, amongst at least 40 who are deceased and whose bodies are held by Hamas. And of course, many alive, which we hope and pray, especially them, but all of them should return immediately to their families. And not only does this barbaric enemy have zero sensitivity to international norms of morality, i.e. non-combatants on the other side, they have even less concern for their own civilians. Who, for heaven's sake, would build launching pads for missiles under hospitals, under kindergartens, in regular homes? Who would do such a thing? And somebody, I heard on a YouTube video a number of weeks ago that there isn't one bomb shelter in Gaza, not one. In every single home, in every single kindergarten, every single public space, in every single wedding hall, everywhere, there are bomb shelters to protect civilians in Israel from the barbaric missiles of Hamas. Yet, as we all know, in Gaza, there isn't one bomb shelter. All of the citizens and civilians are exposed, men, women, and children, young and old, and who are protected in this labyrinth of tunnels underground, tunnels of terror, only for two types of people, for the terrorists and for the barbaric act of taking hostages, our children, our parents, and our siblings. And furthermore, I believe the most barbaric act, arguably the most immoral act that a person can do, is stealing other human beings. And how do I know? How can I claim that that is amongst the worst possible inhumane human act? Because our sages teach us this. In fact, the first time the word Hamas appears, Hamas is also a Hebrew word. It's a Hebrew word which means violence and violent robbery. It's the very reason, this Hebrew word Hamas is the reason that the world in the time of Noah had no moral raison d'etre and needed to be destroyed. Because it says in the beginning of Parshat Noach, Vatimalei haaretz Hamas. The world was full of Hamas. And I'd always understood Hamas to mean a type of robbery. People stole from each other. People are violent. They didn't respect each other's property. No, says the Targum Onkelos, the oldest and most ancient commentary on the Torah. He says that would not be enough of a reason to destroy the world. He says, Vatimalei haaretz Chatufim. Those are the words of the Onkelos. The world was full of Chatufim, hostages. When human beings cannot respect the dignity and security of another person's home, where in broad daylight you can walk into another person's home and steal them, Allah avil b'chapam, for not having done anything other than being a civilian and a human being, to conjure up these ideas that you can go across a border and steal 10-month-old children, kfir bibas, steal octogenarians, steal the infirm. We know that this is exactly what we just read about in Parshat Ki Teitzei. What are the fingerprints of Amalek? What represents Amalek in the world? And it says explicitly, why is it that God has an eternal battle with this epitome of evil, this nation which no longer exists? There's no longer a nation of Amalek. We know that since, for 2,700 years, since the Assyrian king Sancherib muddled and meddled the nations of the world, there are no nations of antiquity. And says Rav Soloveitchik, of course, Amalek as a people no longer exist. But where can you see the ideology of Amalek? Where can you see the footprints of Amalek? Look for the following absolute evil of Amalek. And what did they do? And it says explicitly, Vayezanev b'cha kol hanechashalim acharecha. What did Amalek do? They were not interested in combatant against combatant. They waited specifically for the weak, the infirm, the people who are unable to keep up, the people who are outside, perhaps the clouds of glory could not keep up with Moses and the healthy people, the young and the infirm, and specifically pillaged, took them hostage for the sake, as we see through Tanakh, for selling them, for trading in them. And therefore, Hamas as a regime, and I'm talking here about the regime Hamas, and any regime which sees as its focus the following threefold diabolical moral perversion. A, to have no regard for civilians on the other side, have little or even less regard for civilians on your own side, and worst of all, perhaps, to develop an ideology which goes and specifically targets, steals, and takes hostage the civilians, and especially the old and the infirm. Those are the fingerprints of Amalek. The reason why Hamas as a regime needs to be obliterated off the face of the earth. And of course, when people say, but you can't beat an ideology, the answer is you don't need to beat an ideology. The answer is there are still Nazis in the world today. All these years later, there are millions of Nazis and neo-Nazis around the world. The only difference, of course, is they have no regime. They have no army. They have no machinations of political and military strength, of statehood, of sovereignty, which the Nazis had then. And within 6 years, the European continent was drenched with blood. Not only 6 million Jews, 60 million human beings, 10 times the amount of the Jews were killed because of this barbaric regime. And it only ended when Hitler was killed. 2 days before Hitler was killed, he was still blabbering his lies that the Nazis are going to win and they're insurmountable, etc. And only when he cowardly took cyanide in his own chambers as the Soviets were coming from the east and the Allied from the west, only then was their surrender, was the war over. And we hope and pray that Yechia Sinwar Yamach Shemo, the mastermind of this horrific attack, the Hitler, certainly in terms of modern Jewish history, in terms of our region, will be brought to justice. And then, and perhaps then, we will see a very different goings on. And that is the reason, indeed, why the world was destroyed. Vatimalei haaretz Hamas, the world was full of people of Chatufim who simply thought that another human being is simply a commodity. You can take them like you pick up a stone and a pebble in the ground. You can torture them. You can do whatever you want to them. And you can cynically record them before their death and then release to the families just to cause non-stop anguish. This level of human debauchery, of human debasement, is something we are unfamiliar with as Jews and as Westerners. And part of our challenge in confronting this evil is that we simply can't think like that. We can't imagine it. And sometimes that stands in our way of our ability to defeat it because it's just something which boggles the mind. Our son is one of maybe 20 or 25 soldiers, maybe 30 held in Gaza, which means that the vast majority of the 250 that were taken were not combatants. It was specifically targeting the weak, the infirm, people just getting along with their ordinary lives, many of them peace-loving people. And therefore, we are in an incredible battle to bring back every single one of our hostages, and at the same time to ensure that those who did and plan to do these things will never have the capability of doing it again. So we live at challenging times, painful times, but times, thankfully, that had a pogrom, and I'll end with this, had a pogrom like this happened 80 years ago, 90 years ago, because we know that this pogrom, as we all know, is the worst pogrom since the Shoah, both in terms of quantity and in terms of the depth of depravity. But of course, the difference is, as painful as it is, and so many of us families are mourning and have lost lives of our beloved, and many still to be brought back, and many endangering their lives as we speak. But the difference is, you cannot seek to destroy Jews with impunity. You want to do what you did on October 7th. There is a force on God's earth, the state of Israel, the Jewish state, supported by our friends all around the world, which will do anything and everything to not only bring those to justice, to bring back every one of our hostages, and to ensure that such a danger, everything in our power, will not be able to be done again. And Hamas have brought the destruction of Gaza upon themselves. We all know that if they give back the hostages and surrender early on, the war would be over with them. But that's not the enemy we're dealing with. But thank God, with all the pain and difficulty and challenge, thank God we live in an era that we're able to fight back, that there is a palpable sense of justice, that we're able to do everything we can to protect ourselves and to ensure, to deter that such an act never happens again. So please God, it's okay and it will be okay.
Rabbi Perez, if we may ask you, share with us your story, your son Daniel, his story, and if you could share with us 2 stages in your family's life. The stage when you didn't know, that's when we spoke to you last, and then the aftermath of being informed, but yet not being able to come to a sense of closure where you can take your son, whether it's to Mount Herzl, somewhere else, a place to visit your son. If you could share with us the personal, the story of Daniel, the family's anguish in the twilight zone of not knowing, and then the aftermath of after being notified.
Sure. I'll just say at the outset that although Daniel was declared deceased after 163 days of excruciating waiting and prayer, I'll say in parenthesis, or in inverted commas, we're lucky in that we actually have a grave. We have a grave, even though Daniel's body is not in the grave, because he was injured. And we knew already in the first few weeks that there was blood in the tank and outside the tank and on a uniform. And after about 5 weeks, the blood was confirmed to be our son Daniel's blood. And although it was additionally excruciating to know that our son had been injured, because, you now know what chance does he have of survival when he's also injured, I always felt personally that had Daniel survived the first day, that he would have a very good chance of surviving. He's very strong physically, emotionally, mentally. He is somebody who Hamas need alive. He's a soldier and an officer. And I thought there's a very, very good chance he'll be okay. But the knowledge that he had been injured was very, very painful in and of itself. And also in and of the fact that, we didn't know, what he was going through and what his fate was. But the silver lining in that was, thankfully, we have a blood-drenched uniform. We were able to bury something. The majority of the 40-odd families who have been informed of the death of one of the hostages do not have a burial site. And that is even more excruciating because you have nowhere to go. My wife and I went yesterday to Har Herzl, where Daniel is buried, his uniform and some of the blood in and around the tank. And although his body is not in the, in the grave, thank God we have a tziyun, we have a kever, we have a place to go. Because those who don't, it is even more challenging and difficult to face. So the story of our son, Daniel, is unfolded through us being able to listen after the shiva to the black box of the tank and the recording of the last 2 hours and 16 minutes of Daniel's life. It's quite an unusual, painful experience to listen to the last 2 hours and 16 minutes of one's son's life, knowing how it's going to end. But at the same time, it was a privilege to listen to the last 2 hours and 16 minutes of his life, how the decisions he made and how he conducted himself. We know that Daniel and his tank crew got into their tank at 6:45 in the morning, 10 to 15 minutes after the first barrage of missiles came. We know from the black box of the tank and all the internal communication that for the first 2 hours from 6:45 a.m. on Simchat Torah, 7th of October, until 8:45, Daniel and his tank crew fought with incredible bravery to fend off, both in Nachal Oz base and outside Nachal Oz base, the hordes of the first Nukhba terrorists. Nachal Oz base was one of the worst affected, not one of the worst, it was the worst affected base on the first day in terms of sheer numbers. 54 soldiers were killed in and around Nachal Oz base and 11 taken hostage, which most of them have been declared deceased. Of the 300 soldiers killed throughout the fighting in the first day, 54 were from Nachal Oz, not including, as I said, the hostages. That's a huge number. Hundreds of terrorists poured into Nachal Oz base throughout the morning in order to neutralize the base, knowing that it's the key to the defense of Kibbutz Kfar Aza, Kibbutz Nachal Oz, Kibbutz Saad. So Daniel fought bravely for 2 hours against the first wave, killing many terrorists. He returns to his tank position at 8:45 just outside Nachal Oz base, in fact, just outside Nachal Oz kibbutz, as a protection to the kibbutz. And here's the critical moment. He sees that 50 or 60 Nukhba terrorists riding on motorbikes are now coming in with their RPG missiles, and knowing that each one is a killing machine. He knows that he is the last tank standing in the area. He is the last line of defense. Most of the soldiers have been killed. And therefore, he makes a very critical decision. Many officers have told us that it would have been more than acceptable for Daniel and his crew to stay where they were, to shell and bombard the terrorists. And maybe they would have killed 10 or 20. And that would have been acceptable. They were staying in their tank position. Nobody commanded him to leave his tank position. But Daniel understood intuitively. And when you listen to the recording, it is so clear and obvious. He didn't hesitate for one moment, because the oath that you take as a soldier in the Israeli army, and any army for that matter, is to defend at all costs the country and civilians that you have sworn to protect. And therefore, without a thought, I don't believe, listening to the tape, that Daniel thought he was going to his death. I believe that Daniel thought he was sticking to the mission at hand. He was simply doing what you need to do. Lahavdil, you see in sport, you're getting attacked, you're the defense, and many people run past you, and they pass you, you do everything. You run until you drop, to do everything you can to stop scoring a goal. Lahavdil, in this case, it's not about scoring a goal or a touchdown or netting something. It's about killing people. And therefore, he did anything and everything he could. He left the security of his tank position. He went straight at them, knocking many over, shelling. He had to put his head out of the tank in order to hold the machine gun of the tank that the officer has, and using that machine gun, they warded off and killed many of the terrorists. And towards the end of the battle, at around 9:01, Daniel was shot in the back of the neck. We didn't know he was shot in the back of the neck until he was declared dead, because in the declaration of his death 163 days later, it was based on footage of him on the back of a motorbike in Sajiyah in eastern Gaza City at around 12 noon. And there he has a wound in the back of his neck, and it adds up with the description and the audio of the battle itself. He was definitely badly injured, perhaps mortally wounded, and killed already in the tank. And they literally fought until they could fight no longer. They were shot at RPGs, and it turns out that 3 out of the 4 tank members were killed. Tomer Leibovitz, Hashem Yikom Damo, was found dead in the tank and buried 10 days later on the 17th of October. And Daniel's other tank mate, Itai Chen, who's also an American citizen, whose family are also Americans, they're Israelis, but also Americans. Itai and Daniel were killed probably before they crossed the border, and Itai was declared dead on day 156 and Daniel on day 163. In terms of your question of how we handled it before and after, it's a fascinating question, a harrowing question, because it really is a very, very different experience, and different family members handled it differently. I think I handled, if I can give myself a mark, I think I handled the first 163 days better than thereafter. Because of the first 163 days, even though it was so excruciating, I somehow was able to hold on to hope and to translate anxiety and angst into action. As long as I could do for Daniel, when I lay awake at night and was fearful, I managed to direct my thoughts towards one thing: what can I do to bring Daniel out of Gaza? And really my life became predominantly, for those 163 days, about doing everything we could to bring him out of Gaza. So somehow, because my comfortable default position is one of action, I was in a comfort zone, although I was in an excruciating comfort zone, but a comfort zone where I was able to take the experiences and direct them towards action. What I found so difficult on day 163, knowing that Daniel had been killed, was now that there was nothing I could do. The finality, spending all of that time, hope is lost and there's nothing I can do. Yes, I can still try to bring his body back, and we are trying, but it's not the same bringing back for burial in a coffin to bring him back alive. And therefore, I feel that because I handled the first 163 days relatively well, I struggled post thereafter, because my very strength and strong point and advantage in being able to direct my angst towards action is the very same pitfall when I couldn't do anything. And therefore, that finality, I think I cried on that morning more than I've ever cried before, the morning of the funeral, and that was excruciatingly painful. My wife had a different experience. My wife's most excruciating days were those 163. She just couldn't function. The thought of our son being in Gaza and being tortured, it just was too much. She just couldn't take the angst and anxiety to a place of action. I was the one to take the place of action. It was paralyzing. It was just unimaginable. And I've often said, watching and seeing and experiencing the suffering of my wife is the closest I've been to the deepest human suffering I've ever seen. My wife is particularly close, as mothers are to their children. I was very close to Daniel, but I didn't speak to Daniel every day in the army, a couple of times a week. And when we did speak, we spoke about leadership. We spoke about what he was doing in the army. My wife spoke to him about what he's eating. She spoke to him about what he's wearing. He didn't like the cold at all. He was a very fussy eater. So when she spends her life thinking about Daniel, what he's eating and how he's dressed, so one can only imagine that's what she's thinking about every day and every second in the tunnels of Gaza. That was just kashem minaso, just too difficult to bear, incredibly painful. Yet somehow, my wife told me at the end of Shiva, when I asked her how she's doing on the Shabbos of Shiva, she said, Doron, it's actually easier for me now than it was in the first 163 days. I said, Shell, how can you say that? How can you say that now there's no hope and he's deceased? It's easier. She said, because I don't have to worry. I know now that Hamas didn't have him alive for 1 second. I know, and we know from the video and from the chief rabbi of the army told us, he didn't suffer. He was probably killed instantly. He didn't suffer. He won't suffer. He isn't suffering. He'll never suffer. She said the worry for him was just too much to bear. She said the pain now is her pain. And somehow it feels that her pain she can deal with because it's her pain. And it doesn't in any way reflect the pain and the worry of a child. So certainly I think for my wife, the first few weeks thereafter brought a level of relief. I wouldn't say that that's what she's feeling today, because of course now the juxtaposition of him having been a hostage is no longer as acute. Now it's the reality of him being deceased. So it's incredibly, incredibly painful and sore. But there's no doubt in the transition from day 163 to 164 was very different for me, very different for my wife, and each one of us experiences it and handles it in a different way.
If I could ask you to speak now as a parent, looking at your other children, in the aftermath of this, we read all kinds of literature here in the States in terms of American GIs. We think about the parents, and the most horrific thought possible is that a parent has to bury a child. There's nothing worse than a parent having to bury a child. But we don't necessarily focus here in the States on the siblings, in that dynamic. A part of them has died as well, having to bury a brother. How you as a parent relate to your other children and how they're dealing with the loss of their brother.
During the Shiva, like all the Shiva commemorations of hostage parents and of those who've fallen, there's a tremendous feeling of Am Yisrael. People come from all around Israel and around the world, those who are here, to come and pay their respects and wish their condolences and be Menachem Avel. Many different people come. People who maybe their mission is they've lost children themselves, they've lost soldiers. They come and they share something, they give you something. One of those people came and took me aside at the Shiva. I can't remember his name. I don't know who he is. He came and spoke to me for 2 or 3 minutes, and he said to me the following. He said to me, Doron, I can see that you seem to be handling this, with strength. Yeshar koach. But he said, I want to give you some advice. He said, I want you to know that having been through this, it's not enough that you handle this well. That's just the entry to keep yourself afloat. As we say when we get in the airlines, at first, secure yourself and put your mask on, your air mask on before your children, because if you can't look after yourself, you can't look after anyone. But that's not enough. The fact that you've looked after yourself doesn't mean you've looked after your children. That you've just begun to look after. He said, be very mindful of how your wife is handling this. Very, very mindful of how each one of your children is handling it, because each one of them is going to handle it in a different way. And you need to be with them and there for them in their way. It was very profound, and I've been very, very mindful of that. My wife and one of my daughters one of my daughters and myself handle this in a way where we're able to have these type of Zooms and speak publicly and process it, carry our heart in our sleeve, so to speak, and are comfortable to process it in a way that others are privy. My wife and one of my daughters is exactly not like that. They're much more private. They prefer to process this with their closest friends. My oldest son, I'm not sure is how much he's able to process this. He was injured in the first day. He was shot through the thigh in Nachal Oz, actually. He was at our home with his fiancée then and wife today, Galia. He left at 8 o'clock in the morning in Yad Binyamin and fought for 6 hours in different places. He was eventually shot in the thigh. We decided to go ahead with the wedding, with all the deliberations, this small wedding. He got married, injured, recovered, and went back into active duty. I think by his own admission, he hasn't had the mind space, the head space to emotionally process this. He's gone back into active duty. So I think each one handles it in their own way, but absolutely, it affects every single person. Israel's very good. I don't know how other countries are, but Israel provides support to all the family members, the social workers who worked with us, work with every family member. There's some type of financial remuneration on a monthly basis from the Ministry of Defense for deceased soldiers to parents and to siblings. I mean, to a less extent siblings. But there's a sense of taking responsibility. And yeah, it affects everyone. It affects grandparents. I think my father, I think, was just absolutely broken, especially in the first 163 days. I feel that my mother handled the first 163 days with less brokenness, but now is more broken. You know, everybody, this affects so many people in so many ways. And as you also said at the outset, you know, our son hasn't unfortunately yet been buried. Yes, we buried his blood and we were grateful to have a funeral and a grave, but there's still an open wound. We're not only mourning, we're also praying, being active and doing whatever we can to bring back our son, which is very daunting because we see, you know, that we're struggling to bring anyone back, very few, and certainly soldiers, officers are not going to be at the front of any line that Hamas is prepared to entertain. So it's a very harrowing situation. And as you correctly said, it does affect each person and each sibling and each grandparent. And, you know, we have to try our best as we are to process it individually, but also together as a family.
You know, you've served, you know, as a symbol, as a role model. It's not something you ever wanted to do. It's not a place you ever wanted to be in. But you've served as a symbol and a role model to all of us, not only those in Israel, but those of us in the diaspora, especially those of us in the diaspora who had you as a role model before, who dealt with you, who worked with you. What would you share with us in terms of, and now I'm asking you to speak again as a father, in terms of the communities reaching out, whether it's to the Perez family, whether it's to the Chain family, whether it's to any family. If you could share what are some of the, how do I say this, some of the appropriate things to be doing, what's not appropriate. And I'm sure many people with the best of intentions have approached you, your wife, your children, probably not done the most appropriate things, not out of malice, but just not out of ignorance. If you could share with us, because many Americans, you know, we have many programs that the Ministry of Defense asks us to fund for bereaved families. In fact, at FIDF, we've committed over $26 million to the bereaved families. And many of our donors and supporters who are involved in that want a relationship, want to care, want to touch base. Can you share with us in the interactions maybe what's appropriate, what's not appropriate?
Look, I'll speak about what I think is very helpful and appropriate. You know, on so many levels, you know, what our sages say, call nosei ba'olim chavero, to just shoulder the pain and the burden with our brethren, brothers and sisters in their pain. And that's the most important principle. And that expresses itself in so many ways. Messages that people send, people who've got a connection to people and people who don't. A lady arrived at our door, a young woman, 23 years old, from one of the neighboring yeshuvim, with a challah that she baked and a cake because she said it's her birthday. And there's a custom to bless on her birthday. We didn't know. She just came and gave my wife a hug and said, I've just come to give you challah for Shabbos and to bless you and been davening for your son. So here's a not so random act of kindness of somebody you don't know, and it's very, very touching. And of course, those who do know as well, sending messages that you're thinking about people, and that's of course very appropriate. There's a lot to daven for, to daven and pray for those who need comfort, healing for those who need to be returned, the hostages. And then, of course, as you said, it's the also expressing solidarity. The solidarity missions are very meaningful. I've heard from so many soldiers who are injured, and you might have seen it firsthand going to Tel HaShomer, and it makes a tremendous difference when people that you don't know from all over the world come and just give chizuk and give a hug and are there for you and want to do for you. I know soldiers who said just even a card of a few hundred shekels, you know, which nobody expects, but even that, yeah, any little thing which lightens their burden in any way, first and foremost, just being there for them, even without any financial assistance, is incredible. And of course, financial assistance is looking for those gaps. Thankfully, we're not, each one's got their own solace. My son's injuries recovered from, basically, and our other son is a deceased hostage. So we haven't been through the other excruciating pain of having a very badly injured, for life and maimed son. But there's ongoing support needed there. So for those who are bereaved, there's ongoing need for support. Sometimes it's financial, sometimes it's otherwise. And certainly for the injured families, just the ongoing challenge of just, being able to function again. So I think being able to, express solidarity, love, concern, and just being there for people through messages, through solidarity missions, through whatever support one can offer is amazing. And of course, identifying gaps, because even though Israel's amazing and the army is amazing and civil society is amazing, there are always gaps and there are always people in need, and everyone is dealing with their challenges. So to find the ways to do one's research and find the ways that one can assist different people in a way that's meaningful to them financially as well.
Thank you, really. And it's hard to have words when we speak with you, but we're very grateful for you sharing with us, for you giving us insight, and for you sharing the cathartic experience that you've been through. It's an experience that we wouldn't wish on any human being, what you've been through over the course of the past year. But to many of us outside of Israel as well as in Israel, you and your family have been a symbol, you've been a role model. And, we learn from you through your pain, just like we learned from you before your pain. And I just want to wish you, your family, your expanding family, now that your son is married, a meaningful year, a year of comfort, of nechama.
Amen.
And to the Jewish people who need incredible comfort in nechama, we want to wish a year of comfort to all of us.
Amen. I'd just like to also thank you very much for that, and just to wish you and your family and to the whole FIDF family and all of Klal Yisrael, to the friends of the IDF. As I said at the outset, it's hard to think of a more apt, appropriate, and holy endeavor today to be a friend of the IDF for the reasons I articulated in the beginning. And I just want to wish you and all of us a year where we need so much siyata d'shmaya, help from above, so much healing, so much returning of the hostages, so much assistance in facing the multi-front war that we're facing. And please God, Hashem should make 5785 the most incredible year of healing, of health, and only good things for the Jewish people.
Amen. Thank you, Rabbi. Thank you very much.